Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Fiona Hunter, and I am Associate Director at the Center for Higher Education Internationalization at the Università Cattolica in Milan, Italy. And I am in conversation today with Francisco Marmolejo, a man who has traveled the world all over, talking about higher education and internationalization, and is now based in Qatar at the Qatar Foundation as education advisor. Francisco, would you just like to say a hello to everyone?
Hi, Fiona. How are you doing? I'm very pleased to participate with you in this conversation that I hope was going to be of interest for the audience of the conference.
Thank you, Francisco. So the title of our session today is Reinventing Internationalization of Higher Education for the Post-Pandemic World, Global Issues, Local Actions. And Francisco and I have decided that we will focus specifically on the local actions, because there's much talk of reinventing internationalization of higher education in the face of global issues. But I think the real question is, what does it mean at the local level? Because there's always a danger in higher education that we develop the rhetoric, but we're not always able to turn that rhetoric into reality. And although we're all feeling a bit depressed in the current context, I think it's also true that the foundations of new models are often set in the darkest days of a crisis. So I think it's worth thinking about the future of internationalization now, about how it will be affected by this experience. So what we're going to do in this conversation is we're going to take the institutional perspective and we're going to think about it in real time, right now. What should universities be doing today to prepare for tomorrow? To do that, we thought that the call to reinvent internationalization of higher education is requiring universities to undertake a comprehensive review of their operations. Never more than before do we need to focus on the why of internationalization before deciding the what and the how. And so our conversation with you today will be shaped by 4 elements that constitute a higher education institutional framework that I call the MARS model. And I will explain the elements of that model as we progress through our conversation. And as we go through that conversation, please feel free to drop any comments, questions into the chat, and we'll pick up as many of those as we can when we get to the end of our conversation. So let's kick off. In the MARS model, M stands for mission, vision, and values. Every university has a unique purpose, which is expressed via its mission, vision, and values. And that vision, mission, and values will evolve in response to its external and perhaps also its internal context. And to answer the why of internationalization, we have to start with our purpose and think about how internationalization can support the delivery of our mission, vision, and values. So, Francisco, if we look at the world in the current context, what do you see as the value of internationalization, and in what way is it an enhancer of mission, vision, and values?
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. And then before I do that, I'd like to say thanks to you for accepting to participate in this dialogue. I should say the audience, Fiona is also well known internationally. She has traveled the world as well. I had a pleasure of meeting her when she was president of the European Association for International Education. And since that time, we have developed an excellent friendship, and we keep in touch, and we believe in the importance of internationalization. Our challenge is to convince others. And I think today, the audience that is participating in our session also are convinced about the importance of internationalization. The difference is in the how. And also the difference is in the why. And those are the kind of things that we need to respond. I always like to do that by putting together this in kind of a FODA analysis, by saying, what is the type of institution that I'm at? Am I working at an institution in which internationalization is a significant economic driver? Am I working at an institution in which we believe in internationalization in a much more holistic way? Do we think internationalization in a more traditional way? And I think those are significant elements to respond before we decide what to do. But why internationalization is important? We might have the risk in today's world, Fiona, that during the pandemic, people might say, well, you know, internationalization is mobility of people. If there is no mobility of people, consequently, there is no internationalization. And that applies to the offices of international education programs. And I can tell you about many institutions that, using that rationale, have decided to reduce and or shut down their international education operations. But internationalization is more important than ever for many reasons. First of all, because internationalization is not a goal. It's at the end of the day a tool towards a much more relevant education. So if we believe that the future will demand individuals with a very good understanding of the challenges of a very complex world, but also with a very strong sense of community, the community that they are working and living and interacting with, there is no doubt that internationalization can and should be an excellent tool to prepare people with that type of mindset. So if we have that in consideration, then we can think about the ways in the context, very unique context of my institution, the ways in which I can make of internationalization something relevant, not for the signing of agreements, not for the attraction of international students, but more important, for the more adequate preparation of the students that will be the graduates and the citizens of the future. I don't know. Tell me about you, Fiona. How do you see that?
Yes, I like that you pick up on rationales, because I always think when we talk about internationalization, there are more or less four overarching rationales. You mentioned the economic rationale and the academic rationale, but there's also the prestige rationale today.
Yeah.
Many universities engage in internationalization principally for prestige.
Especially in the age of the rankings.
With rankings, and it can lead to a conflict of internationalization because there become competing rationales.
Absolutely.
So what you want to do academically, or what you want to do for the fourth rationale, which is social, if you see internationalization as a means to make a contribution to society,
exactly,
there can be conflicts. So I think what's important is that there's that honest conversation within the institution that says, okay, academic, rationale, economic, prestige, social, which ones are important for us? What combination do we want to have? And how will we manage these, what may be competing priorities?
Absolutely.
We have to have the conversation up front and say, yes, we want to go for prestige, but we also want to do other, we have other rationales for internationalization, and state them clearly. Otherwise, what happens is you get the gap. It says one thing on the website, but there's something else happening in the institution.
It's the cases of what I refer to as internationalization by decree. You know, when an institution decides that they are international, and that shows in the website, but there is a big gap between the good intentions or the image and the reality.
Yeah, indeed. And you also mentioned, you said, what kind of graduates do we want? And I think that's another key point, because the graduates are the ambassadors of our institutional mission. They bring the mission alive when they go out into the world. And I think most universities today have what we call graduate characteristics or graduate attributes. They have a set of characteristics and attributes that they say their students will acquire during the time that they are at the university with them. And very often these characteristics, again, are often quite empty statements. You know, they look nice on the website again, or they're in the brochures. But to what extent are they really being picked up? Because if you look at them and say, Are there international dimensions in our graduate characteristics? Should there be international qualities that we're looking to develop in our graduates? And then how will we do that? But first of all, we have to start at the top.
And if I might add to that, Fiona, because I think it is very important, that element for those participating at this session, I think there is something that we always should keep in mind. Unless we build the culture of evidence, everything is going to be based just on rhetoric, good intentions, a lot of talk, but not concrete action. So always I challenge people when I speak with them by saying, you know, unless you know if things are happening, if this type of international dimension, this type of graduate that you are having, it is happening because what you do, independently of what you do, or despite of what you do. So it might be the case that even our internationalization efforts are not only not contributing to that, but even probably are impeding that. And the only way we have to do, the only option we have is precisely to build the evidence, to gather the data, to develop the instruments that allow us to know what is really happening there. Because also at the same time, that's the only thing that will sustain our arguments on why internationalization is important. We can argue internationalization is important with nice words, but if we sustain that with evidence and data, then we are in a different game.
Absolutely. You know, so I think, you know, when we're talking about what happens, let's say, as a first stage in internationalization around the why, I always say what is important, whatever direction you choose, whatever the rationale or the combination of rationales, it must link to the institutional purpose.
Of course.
What is the mission, vision, and values of that institution, and how will internationalization enhance those? In other words, we talk about mission-driven internationalization. That's where you can answer the why.
Yeah, although there is a challenge, of course, on that, Fiona, and I'm sure that in institutions you see that, of course, there are different ecosystems living within the same larger ecosystem. So you might find some schools, colleges, whatever the organization is, that are more precisely driven towards one of the rationales, while there is another one which is completely going into the opposite direction. And I think our challenge, but at the same time as opportunity as institutional leaders, is how to reconcile all those different perspectives, but also how do we find, you know, the shared narrative, the shared storyline to which we will stick, recognizing our own respective differences. I don't think we should cancel that diversity. What we need to do is to embrace that diversity and identifying, you know, what is the common storyline, and then just to work towards that.
And of course, it's an ever-changing storyline.
Absolutely, it's not static.
Nothing is going to stay set in stone, but it's ensuring that there's that institutional conversation taking place. So if we imagine our institution has had that conversation and has come to an understanding, a shared understanding within the institution around what internationalization means and why they want to engage with it. That takes me back to my model, and I say now that we have our mission, vision, and values around internationalization, we then need to move from the statements to the actions. And that takes us to the A in the MARS model, because A stands for academic activities. And in any higher education institution, the principal means through which it will deliver its mission, vision, and values is through its academic activities. Teaching and learning, research, external engagement.
Public service, yeah.
Okay, third mission, whatever, community engagement. There are many, many ways that third mission might be defined. And given that we don't have much time today, you mentioned earlier, you know, the crisis around mobility. So let's start by focusing on the dimension of teaching and learning, in particular, in the student dimension of internationalization. What do you see? I mean, are we in a post-mobility world, or how will mobility develop? But more importantly, is it really all about mobility? Has this offered us an opportunity to think much more broadly about internationalization and to say, if we really think internationalization is important and we want all students to have an international dimension in their educational experience, the only way is via the curriculum.
Yeah, the curriculum and also the set of activities beyond the curriculum, but also with the same idea that it should spread out as much as possible to the entire student population and faculty members and staff of our institutions. I think it's interestingly because, the pandemic has become a significant wake-up call for the world, for higher education and for internationalization of higher education. And is mobility going to disappear? I don't think so. Is mobility going to have, to be on hold? Yes, it is happening right now. But the fact that that has happened, it has provided us a unique opportunity to reinforce something that it has been mentioned many times, and there is a lot of analysis and studies and advocacy on the idea of different variations, comprehensive internationalization, integral internationalization, you name it, depends on the name you want to choose, but the concept behind the scenes is more or less the same. Let's make possible internationalization, not as a goal, but as a means towards the entire academic community. And of course, the best tool we have, Fiona, in our higher education institutions is the curriculum. And if we really figure out ways to add a dimension into the curriculum, we know automatically that we are providing tools for all the ones who experience the curriculum. Do we want to do that by making students suffering the curriculum or enjoying the curriculum? That is up to us. Do we need the teachers in order to do that? Absolutely. If the teachers are not convinced about it, if the teachers don't have the tools to do that, and also if the teachers don't have the mindset and also the training to do that, it is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to transmit to the students that energy, passion, and interest for the international dimension of what they are learning. But I truly believe, Fiona, that international makes sense only if it makes sense locally. So the relevance of the international makes sense only if you are going to be able to translate that into day-to-day life in whatever place you are going to be living. Might be today here, tomorrow in other place. But unless you find that, again, connection between the good intentions and the realities, it is going to be something that is going to be different. Let me give you one example. Why do we want to learn another language? Just because the sake of learning another language, and or because we want to think in another language? Well, that makes a significant difference. And of course, all of that, Fiona, in my opinion, requires for us to think, first of all, how do we reimagine, redesign our academic programs, embedding that dimension, but also how do we design the rest of the activities of what it is the academic life of the students and faculty members and staff in our institutions, aligning it towards this idea of the international, because it's the place in which we live, the world in which we live, the planetary experience, as Edgar Morin makes a point about it, but also it is the one that affects, good or bad, our day-to-day life, even in the place that we are. That's where I think international becomes really a vibrant part of our higher education institutions.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know. How do you see that?
I totally agree with you, Francisco. And it goes back to what we said before. We were talking about the graduate characteristics. That's where you start. Because if we have an international dimension built into those graduate characteristics, then they can be picked up in the program learning outcomes, because the curriculum belongs to the academics and the students. It is at, you say, the local level, but then we can break the local level down into all the different programs at the different levels, because what it means to have an international dimension for somebody who studies geography as opposed to nursing, as opposed to biology, will be completely different. And so that process of getting from the graduate characteristics down to the program learning outcomes and the module learning outcomes, where academics discuss the value of an international dimension, which will mean something very different in each program. And students are considered a resource in that process to understand the value of their contribution as well, how they see the world developing for them. Then, of course, it's an ongoing process. It's a never-ending process.
That's correct. That's correct.
It's the only way to offer something to all students. And then within that, we can say, where does mobility sit in the curriculum? Mobility isn't just something that happens outside the curriculum. It's an integral part of the curriculum. And then we can say, is it physical or virtual?
That's correct.
But it has to be linked. I always say mobility must be linked to learning outcomes. It's part of the student's learning experience, wherever that takes place.
It is correct. It is correct. I was interesting. I was reading just the annual statement or State of the Union, State of the University of an institution in my own country, in Mexico, in which they, in this State of the University, the president very interesting transition they made in now referring to, students being benefited by the international dimension of the university, has been translated into changes in the curriculum, virtual mobility programs in today's world, and also some of the other additional activities. So this is a very good way to start measuring all those additional activities that go beyond this traditional sense that internationalization is either student mobility or signing of MOUs. That's another, very sort of, I might say, not very positive way that institutions use as a proxy of the degree of internationalization. And probably you hear me saying that before. I joke by saying that the degree of internationalization of a university is inversely proportional to the number of MOUs or memorandum of understanding that they have signed. So the more MOUs you have, probably the less internationalized you are, or probably you travel the most.
Indeed. Listen, Francisco, I know the two of us could go on talking forever. I'm conscious of time, and I'm looking over here and I can see some questions coming in. I'd like to be able to share some with you. So I'm going to just bring together in the MARS model, we've talked about mission, vision, and values, and then you think about how do you bring the mission into your academic activities. But the other two elements of that model are support services and resource management. Support services, all these professional services within the university, resource management can be financial or human resources management. And you've already touched on this. I'm going to bring it together in one question. One is, how do we prepare our students to become global graduates, but also how do we prepare our staff, not just the academic staff, but the support staff, to engage in internationalization? And where do we find the financial resources for internationalization? Everywhere I go, people say, oh yes, we'd love to do that, but we don't have the money to do it. I actually think most of the time they don't have the people to do it. There's a lot you can do with human resources before you need extra funds. So maybe just if you could kind of reflect a little bit on the people and the funds that go with internationalization, then I'll pick up some questions here that are coming in the chat. Yes,
well, I think something that is important to keep in mind is that universities cannot be seen as isolated from the rest of the educational system, and of course from society. This idea of the university as the ivory tower should be challenged and should be questioned. And so why I mention this, because when I find a sort of a reason why internationalization is important is when we talk about the skills that are going to be needed for the grounded, responsible, and effective and committed citizens of the future, which are our responsibility in our higher education institutions. But we know that the 3, 4, or 5 years that students are in our institutions are not enough. Many times there are some behaviors that probably might be too late to embrace those during the time at the university. So unless we pay attention to what happens in the previous levels of education, and unless we see that as part of our responsibility in higher education, but also as part of our opportunity in higher education, it is going to be just very difficult to be as effective as we would love to be in just the 3 or 4 years of the life of the students that they are going to be interacting in our institution. Let me tell you, for instance, one example. The sort of the multicultural awareness and the capacity of tolerance as an important element of the successful citizens and graduates of tomorrow cannot be just magically only been obtained for the last 3 or 4 years. It's the last opportunity, but it's not enough. So we need to build those things from the beginning. The same happens with the passion and the interest for the learning of the languages. The same happens for the understanding of things that happen in the world and the passion for those things that happen in the world. So we in higher education need to see this as part of a continuum. And for that matter, we need to work more with the previous levels of education. Now, the second thing briefly, Fiona, in terms of the money, in terms of the funding, where the money is for those type of things. Well, we in international education learn to know the door first. So it's we need to take a much more active role. And also, of course, we need to identify which ones are the right partners to bring to the table in order to contribute to supporting the kind of activities that we do. I can tell you about the many cases in which those partners are eager to help, but probably nobody already asked for support for those things. I remember an anecdote, very brief, that I mentioned when I was director of the Consortium for North American Higher Education Collaboration. One day, I was sitting on, traveling, flying with a guy that I recognized in the magazine of the airline. And I saw him. I said, "Oh my God, he's the CEO of the company." So anyways, I start chatting with him. And then I said, I have a question. I said, "You have a lot of empty seats here in your plane. So why don't we put together a program under which you allocate some of those seats for the most flexible travelers in the world, which are the students, which are willing to come today to the airport. And if there is a seat, they will take. If not, they will come tomorrow." And I said, "Well, send me a letter and I will be happy to entertain that possibility." So based on that, we were able to put together a very interesting program, just being supported by that airline, using those empty seats of the students. So the same I can tell you about many more programs like that, that allow for the possibility of internationalization by bringing the right partners to the table. Many of the things that are related to internationalization don't cost, are the resources that we have available that probably we are not tapping properly and that we are not taking advantage of. Even many of our students are a resource for internationalization, the same as faculty members, the same as members of the community, the same as peers from other countries which are willing to share and to contribute with experiences with their own perspective. So there are many things that can be done.
Well, I think you're hitting on a key point there. I mean, it's not just about thinking more broadly about internationalization. It's thinking more broadly about who we are as higher education institutions. A lot of what you said takes me back to the A of the Mars model and the academic activities and that third mission in higher education, where we engage with our communities, whatever we perceive these communities to be, and build partnerships with them.
Yep.
And that whole piece you said around engaging with schools to ensure that internationalization is not a novelty they meet when they come to higher education. That's so correct. There's a lot to do about reaching out and merging the international with the local. In that sense, really building it into the mission of the institution. Many universities today say they work for their region or for their local environment, their local communities or whatever. That internationalization is typically seen as something separate from that.
That's correct.
There are many ways, through your example, that the local and the global can be connected and add value by bringing in partners who are willing to work with institutions. So it is about being very resourceful. I agree about
and of course, it is not an easy road. And in fact, I might say, Fiona, now that you were mentioning that, in the age of the rankings and these idea that international is ranking and positioning and prestige and all those things, there are significant dangers, I might say. One, for instance, is that since the incentives are for that type of understanding of internationalization, of course, for instance, our faculty members are going to look at those incentives. And then you have the unfortunate case of universities that see even the local engagement as something that it will sacrifice their capacity to be international. In other words, they see that if they dedicate time to the local, on commitment to the local, they are going to be able to do the international. So it becomes, in a way, the headache of the institutions. And even in the incentive of many of the institutions, you see that faculty members may receive a premium for publishing a paper on a peer review ranking, peer review journal internationally, but they don't receive any incentive or support if they do a program with the community. Even knowing that in the community, probably that's where the students are going to be able to acquire this tolerance and this understanding of different contexts, because probably we are in a community that is already very, multicultural and or international. So I think we need to be very coherent in many ways.
And perhaps making more impact in that community than an article published and read by a small group
of the
people.
peers.
Yeah. So I think that the balancing of the rationales is a difficult one, but it's a conversation we said every university needs to have. I'm looking into the chat here, and of course, digital is coming up. How do you see digital and international? I know there've been some sessions here in this conference on that, but and I know as well that we're getting increasing number of examples of very successful virtual collaboration. So is digital an opportunity? Is it a financial opportunity as well, that we can collaborate internationally without let's say the very high cost of international mobility? But in general, how do you connect digital and international?
Yeah, that's a whole discussion that, as you know, it has many ramifications. I truly believe that, again, this is something that we have learned very quickly during this time. We learned that the digital became a short-term solution. It is not the long-term solution. It's not the permanent solution. The other interesting thing is that the digital engagement in general, of course, is a reflect of the reality of today's life. But at the same time, it is showing the significant inadequacies. One of them, of course, is the digital divide. The fact that just not everybody is having the same level of opportunity in using that tool in order to enhance their learning. Globally, we know that, for instance, that about 70% of international students went back to their respective countries. We know that about 60% of the students globally had been able to continue with some kind of education, which means that 40% are not. 40% are just out of any possibility of continuing their education. And that is a significant problem. And of course, that also translates into the international activities that have been translated to be used with the digital means. Because, again, we need to address that particular gap. It is our responsibility in higher education. Otherwise, we have the risk of being blamed, as we are being blamed when we talk about mobility, that it is elitist by nature, that mobility benefits the better off, and that probably the digitally driven internationalization eventually could be also benefiting the ones who have that technological capacity, and it will not the ones who don't. So we need to address that particular problem. Being said that, taking that opportunity to embrace international in many ways, of course we need to take that. We need to use that, we need to potentiate that, but also we need to be, again, similar to internationalization in the traditional way. We need to have our champions, and our champions are our faculty members, and the faculty members also need to be properly prepared to use that more effectively. And again, translating the typical classroom to Zoom is not truly effective. We need to do much more than that.
Well, that takes us, that's interesting what you've been saying. For me, it links immediately back again to the M in the Mars model and the whole issue of values. And again, where we see this divide, where universities may declare that they are in their values, words such as diversity and equity and access. But then when you look at their international activities, where they're focusing on rankings or on mobility purely as international activity purely as mobility activities, where is the equity and the access there? And so digital just accelerates that process by creating, again, groups that are excluded from the process. So yeah, I think it always goes back to the idea, you know, you've got to be coherent. Who are you? What do you stand for? And then how do you embed that in what you do in everything? But I mean, here in particular in internationalization.
Well, you know, and Fiona, while you check out the other question, I think it is interesting to mention that, you know, we are living in a fascinating social experiment today in the world and in higher education and in international higher education. So what a best time to further learn about that, what is working, what is not working in international mobility, virtual mobility, what is working and what is not working. You know, I see, for instance, many times this point about, you know, the need to shorten the lectures to 20 minutes, the need to dissect the knowledge in micro-credentials, the need to recognize that in the typical curriculum of our higher education institutions. So there is this is a fascinating time, you know, despite the crisis of the pandemic and all the tragedies associated with that, at the same time, what a unique opportunity to learn what it works and what it doesn't work in this digital world in higher education and this digital world in internationalization of higher education. If we wouldn't do it that, if we don't do it now, we will miss a unique opportunity, because soon, I hope soon, things will become more, you know, manageable in the crisis. And so the tendency might be that soon we are going to be back to some kind of normalcy, which is probably the one that we already were having a lot of problems with. So if we don't take the opportunity to change things now, probably we will never.
Yeah, well, I always say internationalization exposes and magnifies institutional weaknesses. And I think any institution that embarks on, you know, a significant internationalization endeavor will discover where its weaknesses are and will need to move quickly to solve them if it wants to engage internationally. And I think the pandemic has done the same thing. It has thrown up areas of weakness in our internationalization as well. And these, again, as you say, are great opportunities, because one thing we've seen, we have discovered that as higher education institutions, we can move quickly. So we have destroyed a myth. You know?
Well, you know, it's for instance, here, that's why I'm, you know, it's fascinating to see in my own day-to-day life here at Qatar Foundation. So because the crisis, because the pandemic, Qatar Foundation did a very interesting decision, which was precisely that, what you are describing. You know, what a best time to review our weaknesses, to do a whole new strategic planning process for the university, for the entire ecosystem here, and then just to try to make reality this concept of a multiversity. You know, keep in mind that here in Qatar Foundation, we have an ecosystem of 27 different educational institutions, from kindergarten to doctoral education, you know, 9 of them universities. So what a best time, a best opportunity that the crisis to say, let's be honest, what is not working, what is just the good ideas, and let's try to rebuild the building of our ecosystem, and of course of our international engagement. And that's where we are right now as part of this process.
That's a really key thing you said there, Francisco. Let's have an honest conversation, because very often we struggle with that. You know, we tell stories, you know, we present ourselves, we showcase ourselves as institutions, but it can be quite hard very often to face up to our weaknesses.
That's correct. That's
I'm
correct.
picking up in the chat and I'm noticing that a number of people are raising the issues here too. One is around graduates and alumni and what's the connection with internationalization, graduates and alumni. And another one coming in around quality assurance. Well, these are huge topics, I know, but maybe you could just say, give us a couple of thoughts on alumni and internationalization, quality assurance and internationalization.
Well, something that in the case of alumni that I think we miss usually in higher education institutions is that we don't tap their expertise, their knowledge, and also the most important, their input and their championship of the institution. How many institutions, I will ask the audience and they might tell, how many institutions have in place a systematic tracer system that allows them to know what is happening with the graduates? And if the graduates, including the ones who experience some type of internationalization experience, what they are doing, in which way what they are doing is or not connected with the educational experience they have. How much of their success, if you want, or failure, we can claim as part of what they lived at in our institutions. How much we can say that what they do is because of the university, despite of the university, or independently of the university. And if we don't have the evidence, it might be very difficult to claim successes that probably are not ours. But if we know that, we not only can do that, but more important, we can provide the best input for the improvement of our educational programs, right? So this is one angle that I think it is important to take in consideration. In addition to the traditional ones, which is that the alumni, if they are doing well, they may support the institution, they may become probably advocates of internationalization, they may speak on their own experience about international in such a way that they can contaminate our students in a positive way, you know, in addition to that. Now, regarding quality, Fiona.
Well, actually, those are really linked because you just talked about evidence. And evidence is all about, you know, is what you need for quality.
That's correct. And regarding quality, briefly, I will say, always I hate to refer to quality assurance because quality assurance means compliance. I always say, unless we transition from quality assurance to quality enhancement, we are going to be just in the club of compliance. And with, you know, this syndrome of accreditation as a synonym of quality and quality as a synonym of, you know, we are doing fine. So we need to change our mindset. We need to really push ourselves. And that happens to internationalization as well.
Yeah, and quality is about continuous improvement, and to improve continuously, we need evidence. We need to know what we're doing, whether it's working or not, how we can improve it, that quality assurance cycle. I absolutely agree. And very often, some institutions, yes, they have this very, let's say, bureaucratic approach to quality assurance. But at the same time, internationalization is often left out of the loop. And so it's absolutely fundamental. It takes us right back to what you were saying about evidence and internationalization. It's not just about telling a good story to others, it's being able to demonstrate the value of internationalization. If we can't do that, okay, we open ourselves up to risk and exposure of not doing a very good job.
Yeah, and even in this crisis, Fiona, I know that we are running out of time, but I will say that unless we who believe in internationalization, which are the ones which are listening to our session today, unless we take the driving seat, I might say, unless we, you know, take our own role in saying, in becoming more stronger and active and vocal advocates of the importance of internationalization, and we equip that with the right evidence, nobody will do it for us. So this is a time also of changing our attitude towards the active involvement in our communities of higher education, in mainstreaming internationalization as is an important tool for the improvement of the relevance of our higher education institutions. If we don't do that, again, nobody will do it for us.
Nobody will do it for us. That's absolutely true. I'm just going looking in here quickly because I think we're almost out of time, but nobody's told me to stop yet, so I'll carry on. Okay. Here's a question saying, do you think there's a new normal coming internationalization. If there's a group, I suppose we've talked about this one a little bit around the reliance on the internet. That one we've picked up on. There's a question here about data, the long-term outcomes and effects of internationalization. I think we
talked a lot about that. Yeah.
Evidence. Oh, here's one we haven't seen so far. What about the ideas of an internationalization strategy at national level? What do you think about that? Because I think we can see globally, there are countries that have strategies and there are countries that don't. And we have institutions that are successful with or without that national strategy.
Yeah.
So,
and there are countries that have good strategy of internationalization, and there are countries which have terrible strategy for internationalization. So I think there is a lot. It's a wide menu of options available. And so there is hope in some cases where you see strongly, very well developed, articulated, innovative and futuristic, I might say, internationalization plans in many countries. Of course, the devil is on the details, because you might have, as you know very well, as an expert, Fiona, as you have been helping many institutions and countries to do their planning in higher education, we might have the best planning and the best strategic plan in internationalization, but if that is not properly implemented, it's going to be the terrible case, and that strategic plan will become a strategic plan. And so, I see, again, it is a crisis, no question about that. The risk of going back to normal, our old normal, it is very high, and it would be very sad. I think we need to go back to a new normal, a normal that is much more sort of innovative, disruptive, a much more sort of visionary about the fact that we have many things to do in order to more effectively connect our higher education institutions to a different world. There is no doubt that it will be completely different. And again, I want to see this as a challenge, of course, but also as the greatest opportunity that we could have. In my presentations, I used a picture of all the planets being aligned. I believe that the planets are aligned for us. If we don't do it now, we will miss this unique opportunity.
Absolutely, and I think we're just about running out of time now, but I just would like to connect with that point you made about institutions are very good, very often, as you say, at writing the plans. The plans are produced, but they don't always see the light of day. Or if they are, they're done in a kind of half-hearted way. And in my experience, traveling around the world, what I often find is that whereas the institutions can produce the plans, they don't have the systems and processes in place in the institutions to make them a reality.
That's correct.
And of course, it's another great challenge for internationalization, but for any part of the higher education endeavor as well, is to create these flexible systems and processes where people can flourish and bring their ideas and make change happen. At that, very often at that micro level, it goes back to the idea of the support services in the MARS model. How do we set up the support of internationalization in a way that those who are engaging are able to make a difference? That the professional services, whether it's the international office or the housing office or the accounts office, whatever, that these people feel committed to the same vision and mission, that they feel it's not a burden, but it's something they can contribute to, that their ideas are welcome, are appreciated, and that there's room for growth, that through internationalization within the institution, there is change as well. There is growth, there is creativity.
That's correct. And that requires, Fiona, a new type of leadership. And that requires for leaders, and a leader means not only the president of our institution, everybody involved in any decision-making, less sort of risk averse and more willing to sort of believe that change is possible. I dream, Fiona, about universities which are more international, but more locally connected. Universities that are more entrepreneurial, less risk averse, more collaborative. I dream about that. but I truly believe that the future is not something that you dream about, that you build today. And I hope that that's what we are trying to do, at least by participating in events like this. And I hope that if our audience is more confused today, that's fine. I think we achieve our goal.
Yes, absolutely. As you say, it's about building the future, and it goes back to what we said at the beginning. Yes, these are dark days for internationalization, but it's an enormous opportunity to be really creative and think about the future of internationalization in a way that internationalization can flourish within the institution, make a contribution to society, both globally and locally, and that it really can enhance the institutional mission. And so there are so many different directions we can go in. The pandemic has shown us the opportunities of digitalization in a way that we could never have seen.
That's correct.
Before. And so, yes, I believe, like you, that change must come, and it must come within the institution as well. It's not only us offering change to others, it's learning from outside the institution so that change can happen in the institution as well. And the internationalization can make a significant contribution to that. So I think we can end our conversation here, Francisco.
It's a pleasure, Fiona. I really enjoyed this conversation with you, and I hope the rest of the audience also, at least, we're excited to hear that there is hope.
There is hope, and there's hope in every single institution, and it's about finding the right focus in that institution to find a new way forward. So we hope that in everything we said, there was something for everyone. And yes, let's end this session here. Francisco, as ever, always a great pleasure talking to you.
The same with me. The same with you. It's a pleasure chatting with you, Fiona.
Until we meet again in the real world.
Yeah, very good.
Again, thank you to our audience. We can't see you, but we know you're out there, and we wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.